everyone, and welcome. Ready to explore something totally new? We're about to dive into the history of Turkish medical language.
A fascinating journey indeed. It really reveals a lot about how language, culture, and science all intertwine.
So strap in. Our guide today is this academic paper right here from a Turkish medical journal.
Oh, very interesting.
It's called, get this, Türkçe tip Eğitimi. Eski ama gerçekleşmiş bir hayalin. Elbirliği yok edilişi. Which translates to Turkish medical education, an old but realized dream collectively destroyed.
Wow, just the title itself sounds like a story waiting to be told. Story of pride, maybe even a bit of struggle.
Exactly. And we're going to uncover all that. We'll see how Western medicine, took a lot from Eastern medicine and then kind of tried to sweep it under the rug.
That's a really crucial point, Recognizing this kind of historical erasure, super important because it shapes how we understand, even today, the evolution of medical knowledge itself.
It's deeper than we think, right? We'll also be exploring the rise and fall of Türkçe tıp, which, if you don't know, means Turkish medicine.
Oh, interesting.
This vibrant, uniquely Turkish medical language, it thrived for centuries. And get this, even today, in Turkey, simple medical exams, they still use these weirdly translated phrases from French.
Really?
It's a wild ride.
Well, what's so interesting about all this is that medical language, it's not just jargon, It shapes how doctors think, how patients understand their own bodies, even how research is done.
It's much deeper than we realize, huh? So to understand where we are now, we got to travel back, way back to the Crusades.
Ah, yes. During the Crusades, Western Europe had this encounter with the intellectual and scientific advancements of the East, particularly in medicine. They were quite impressed, especially by the sophisticated knowledge in the East.
So imagine that knights in shining armor learning from Eastern physicians.
Exactly. And they started translating, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, all these medical texts into Latin. That influx of knowledge, it was incredibly important for how Western medicine developed.
That's a huge exchange of knowledge. But the paper mentions this thing about, Western universities. It says they adopted the architectural style of Seljuk madrasas. Those were, the centers of learning in the Islamic world,
Okay.
right? What's the connection there?
Ah, yes. Madrasas, you could think of them as predecessors to our modern universities. The fact that Western universities drew inspiration from their architecture, well, it shows you how deep this Eastern influence was.
Right.
It wasn't just about the knowledge itself, it was about the systems of learning, the whole approach.
That's a really good point, a deeper level of borrowing. But the paper also mentions that this borrowing, it wasn't always acknowledged. In fact, they say Western scholars would Latinize Eastern terms. So it made it harder to trace their origins.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. The contributions of these Eastern scholars, they were minimized or often even, erased. And that has a lasting impact on how we perceive the history of science, even now.
It's kind of sad in a way. The paper gives some interesting examples of that, like the Trendelenburg position.
Ah, yes.
Which, if you're not a doctor, it's a common surgical technique.
Yeah.
It was actually already described, over 800 years earlier by this Andalusian scientist named Ibn Qasim.
That's right.
And there are others, too.
Oh, absolutely. There's Ibn al-Nafis, for instance. He discovered pulmonary circulation centuries before William Harvey, who, is often given the credit.
Right.
But Ibn al-Nafis' work, it remained, largely unknown in the West.
So we see this massive transfer of knowledge from East to West, but proper credit wasn't always given. How did that then set the stage for what happened in Turkey, specifically?
Well, it laid the groundwork, you could say, for the emergence of a really distinct Turkish medical language, Türkçe tıp, in the Ottoman Empire. And by that point, there were significant efforts already underway to develop it.
Okay, let's dive into that. The paper mentions this 14th century physician, Saladin Hizir. He wrote this book, Muntahabi Hifa, which means selected treatments. What's so special about this book?
Well, Muntahabi Hifa really stands out because it was written in clear, accessible Turkish. It's fascinating. People today can still understand much of it.
Wow.
It shows that a sophisticated Turkish medical language, it already existed long before what many people assume.
That is pretty amazing. And then in the 16th century, we have Berfetin Sabuncuoglu. He was the head physician at the Amase Darüsifasi. Can you, for those of us who don't know, explain what a Darüsifasi is?
Of course. A Darüsifasi, it was essentially a hospital, often with an attached medical school in the Ottoman Empire. There were centers of both, medical practice and learning.
Got it. So Sabuncuoglu wrote this book, Serahi Tulhaniye, meaning imperial surgery. What makes this book so groundbreaking?
Well, Seriyetul Hane is remarkable for two key reasons. First, it was entirely in Turkish. And, maybe even more importantly, it included detailed anatomical drawings, not the traditional miniature paintings that were common then.
Those drawings must have been revolutionary for their time.
Absolutely. This visual approach to anatomy, it was a significant departure from the norm. And it really, underscores the forward-thinking nature of Turkish medicine during that period.
It seems like these early works are powerful evidence against this idea that a scientific Turkish language didn't exist.
Precisely. They showcase this rich, vibrant tradition of Turkish medical knowledge, and it was developing alongside and sometimes even ahead of Western medicine.
Wow. So we have this rich tradition of Turkish medical language developing, but then in the 19th century, things begin to change. Can you tell us about what happened?
Well, the 19th century was a period of, really significant change in the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mahmud II, a reform-minded leader, he wanted to modernize the empire.
Makes sense.
Including its medical system.
So how did this drive changes in medical language specifically?
He decided to establish a modern medical school in Istanbul, one that could be, on par with the best institutions in Europe. But there was a dilemma. There was no established national science language, one that was considered, modern enough for his ambition. He had a tough choice to make.
That's fascinating. A modern medical school, but what language to use? What did he decide?
Ultimately, he chose French as the language of instruction.
Wow. A Turkish medical school, but teaching in French. That's unexpected.
It might seem surprising, but it was a strategic decision. Sultan Mahmud II, he saw French as a temporary tool, a way to access the latest scientific knowledge. In his speech at the school's opening in 1839, he actually said, "My purpose in teaching you in French is not to make you learn French. It is to gradually transfer medical science to our language and then spread it in Turkish throughout the Ottoman lands."
Incredible. So he didn't want to replace Turkish. He wanted to empower Turkish physicians to master, Western science, and then translate that knowledge back into their language.
Yeah, it was a long-term vision of reclaiming this linguistic ownership, over medicine, a vision that still resonates even today.
It's remarkable how his words from the 19th century are still so relevant. We see similar discussions now, right, about language and cultural identity, especially in the context of globalization. What an interesting start to our deep dive.
It is indeed.
Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like he was trying to modernize, but also hold on to, Turkish cultural identity.
Right.
Sultan Mahmud II, he was definitely a visionary leader.
He was walking a tightrope, forward and backward at the same time.
Exactly. His decision to use French, it was strategic. It wasn't about rejecting Turkish. It was about, gaining access to the most advanced scientific knowledge of that time.
He knew to be a player on the world stage, Turkish physicians needed that fluency, right, in the language of modern science, which back then was French. But his end goal, always, bring that knowledge back into Turkish to empower his people.
His speech at the school's opening, it makes that so clear. Almost like he's saying we're learning French, but for a bigger reason.
He saw language as this powerful tool, something that could really drive progress for the whole nation.
Absolutely, and that vision resonated.
Yeah.
Our source mentions this guy, Namık Kemal, a Turkish writer, intellectual. He also really pushed for Turkish language medical education. He believed that, true understanding, it only comes from learning in your native language.
It's about owning the knowledge, right? Not just borrowing it.
Exactly. For Kemal, it was national pride, intellectual independence. That idea is really at the heart of our story here, recognizing the value, the power of your own language. Even in these specialized fields like medicine.
It wasn't an easy path, though. Even after the medical school switched to Turkish instruction, that French influence, it kind of lingered.
Yeah, you can imagine. Early Turkish medical journals, conferences, they were still mainly in French.
Wow.
Think about that. Presenting your research in a language that's not your own.
It's got to feel awkward.
Like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
The paper says this linguistic awkwardness, it had consequences.
Right. There was this thing, translation without thought.
What?
Like some Turkish medical terms got replaced with these, clunky, sometimes nonsensical French translations.
Almost like they overlooked the richness of Turkish, its ability to, express those complex medical concepts.
Yeah.
Maybe they thought French was, more scientific or something.
Well, then we get those funny examples.
Right, like the 40-41.
Yeah, using 40-41 for a lung exam. Because that's how the French phrase got translated.
It's kind of funny, but also points to a bigger problem.
Right.
Just blindly adopting foreign terms without thinking how they fit.
It creates confusion.
Yeah, can even distort medical understanding.
Translation isn't just swapping words out. It's got to convey meaning.
Right.
Accurately and thoughtfully.
Okay, so we move into the 20th century. There's a new challenge for Turkish medical language. English starts to become, the global language of science. How did that impact things?
Well, the pressure to publish in English journals,
Right.
to go to these international conferences where everyone's speaking English, it created a new kind of hierarchy.
So all of a sudden, using Turkish terms, it's seen as old-fashioned, unscientific even.
That's the unfortunate reality. Turkish physicians, they were caught between wanting to be part of that global community and holding on to their own linguistic heritage.
It's a struggle so many cultures face, right? With globalization, how do you benefit from that global exchange, but without losing what makes you you?
And for Turkish medical language, this led to a slow erosion of those traditional terms, even the ones that were perfectly accurate, nuanced.
Like the example the paper gives, fels, the word for paralysis, getting replaced by stroke.
Yeah.
But Turkish has these other terms too, like nuzul, which means descent, or inme, which emphasizes the suddenness.
Right, they offer different perspectives on the condition itself. Like nuzul, with that idea of descent, might suggest a different way of understanding paralysis compared to just saying stroke. It highlights how language shapes how we think about our bodies and illness.
So what we're seeing is this complex legacy, this rich history of Turkish medical language showing, the ingenuity, the curiosity of Turkish physicians.
Right, alongside that, this ongoing struggle to preserve that legacy in the face of, globalization, the dominance of English.
Yeah, it raises this question, like, what is the future of Turkcell Tıp? Can it survive in this environment?
That's a question worth asking. But it goes beyond just Turkish, right? It's about how do we protect the diversity of knowledge, of expression, in a world that's becoming more and more, the same.
It's a big question, but it feels important.
It is. We have choices to make. We can use our voices, our actions, to support that diversity, to recognize that different languages offer valuable ways of knowing, of speaking about the world.
So in the case of Turkish medical language, is there hope? Are people working to preserve it?
Absolutely. Despite all the challenges, there's a growing movement to revitalize those traditional terms, to promote Turkish language medical education.
Okay.
There are scholars, physicians, they're passionate about protecting this part of Turkish culture. They're developing resources, translating those classic texts, raising awareness of how rich Turkcell Tıp really is.
That's encouraging.
Right. It shows people are actively working to make sure this knowledge isn't lost.
It's inspiring.
They're reminding us language isn't just communication. It's a storehouse of knowledge, a reflection of our history, our values. By reclaiming our languages, we're reclaiming a part of ourselves, our identity, our connection to the past.
It's powerful, and it goes beyond Turkey.
It does. It's about recognizing that language is alive, something we can shape, we can nurture, and that diversity is something to cherish, not erase.
This is what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It's not just about Turkish medical language, it's about language itself, right?
Exactly.
It's power to connect us to the past, but also shape how we understand the present and even, inspire us to create a more inclusive future.
Well said.
I'm inspired now to learn more about all the languages, cultures around me.
That's fantastic.
It's like a whole new world has opened up.
The more we explore that diversity of language, the more we expand our own understanding of the world and where we fit in it.
This deep dive has been incredible. Where do we go from here? It's amazing to think this whole world of Turkcell is out there, and most people have no idea.
It shows you just how much history, how much culture is tied up in language. So many stories waiting to be discovered.
And it's not just about the past, right? What can we learn from all this? About the challenges that languages face all around the world, even today.
It really highlights how important linguistic diversity is. Different languages offer different ways of seeing things, understanding the world. It just makes our perspectives richer.
We tend to think of science as this, universal thing.
Yeah.
But even within science, the paper points out there are cultural nuances, different ways of approaching problems, interpreting data.
And those differences, They're valuable.
Yeah.
They broaden our understanding, can even lead to new discoveries.
So losing a language, even one that's specialized, like Turkish medical language, it means we could be losing valuable knowledge, insights.
It's not just about the words themselves, it's ways of thinking, ways of understanding the human experience.
And it makes you think about access to information. If, like, critical medical knowledge is only in English or another dominant language, that leaves entire communities out.
Right, out of those important healthcare decisions.
It's a social justice issue, even.
It is.
What about technology? What role does that play in all of this? Seems like it could go either way.
Technology can be a great tool for preservation. Think about digital archives. All these sophisticated translation tools we have now, those can help to protect and revitalize languages.
But then it can also speed up language loss, right? If everything's online, but only in a few languages.
It marginalizes those who speak less dominant languages.
It's complicated. We have to be careful how we use technology.
Well, absolutely. We need to make sure it's supporting diversity, not undermining it.
So what can we do, like, as individuals, to support the languages that are important to us?
Speaking them, obviously. Reading in them, teaching them to children. Those are all powerful ways to keep a language alive.
Right. It's about using it.
Even just learning about endangered languages that can raise awareness and lead to support.
We can also push for policies that help, right?
Right.
Especially in education.
Absolutely. And challenge that idea that there's only one right language for science, for business, for global communication. The reality is the more languages we have, the richer our world is.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening, really made me think about language differently. It's not just words, it's tied up with culture, identity, even how we understand science and medicine.
And it's a good reminder that we all have a part to play
Yeah.
in preserving this diversity. Every language has value. Every voice deserves to be heard.
Well said. I'm so glad we took this deep dive together. I feel like I have this whole new appreciation for the power of language and how important it is to protect it.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been great exploring this with you.
Absolutely.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. Go explore, discover, and keep the conversation going.